Okay, so people are starting to enter the event, and I'm going to get us started. I really apologize for issues with links and technology, but I'm glad that you're all here and our presenters ready to get going. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Lindsay. I'm a knowledge broker with Gambling Research Exchange Ontario. I want to let you know that your mics have been muted upon entry to this event, which is by design to cut down on background noise. The listeners are welcome to ask questions throughout. You can send them to me via the chat function, and I can moderate that as needed. And then we will stop for questions at the end, where you can use a hand raise function through WebEx, which will signify to me that you have a question you'd like to ask verbally. I can unmute your mic, and you can ask the question to the presenter directly. If you do not have a microphone or an audio connection that you can speak through, you're welcome to send questions via the chat function at that time as well. If you are able to hold your questions to the end, that kind of helps with the flow of the event, but if you have a burning question, please feel free to send me a note. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter, Steve Chiasson. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Lindsay. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for being patient. Your participation in this webinar certainly indicates to me that we share a similar concern around how these two behaviors, gambling and gaming, are affecting youth. And throughout this seminar, we will be looking at that topic in terms of what is the special draw, what is the attraction, and we'll be looking at some of the associated risks with overuse or excessive involvement. These two behaviors are so similar, they're closely related, and they become much more compelling over time, so more and more compelling. And we had thought that it was appropriate to bring them together in this webinar and to talk about them together as they are so closely related. If you're not already aware, gambling was designated as an addictive disorder in 2013, and more recently, due to the more recent accumulation of empirical research, gambling is now classified by the classifications of diseases, ICD-11, as a gaming disorder, which has important implications. The boundaries between these two behaviors have really been blurring over time, and in many different forms now they converge, they come together, and this convergence is becoming more and more appealing to those that discover this convergence and play these platforms. The crossover and its popularity has generated a lot of interest in manufacturers producing more of these products, and at the same time, no surprise that they're targeting youth with these products. So I'm going to talk about these two behaviors in the context of a program I developed back in, well, I'm not able to advance my slides, so I can't actually do that for you right now. Just give me a second. See if we can get it to advance. Hello, Lindsay.
Hi, Steve. You should just be able to click your arrow or your space bar or whatever you use to advance on your computer.
Here we go. My apologies for that. So it's called the Connections Program, and there's a bit of a story to the Connections Program. It originated with me teaching, which I was doing for about a 10-year period in conjunction to the work I'm already doing. And I had the dilemma of how to best convey the concepts, the information to the students I was teaching. And this program was a postgraduate program. And I felt in the beginning that I was falling short, that they just weren't grasping what I wanted them to grasp. And that led me to starting to think about some more innovative ways of delivering this information to help people understand the true nature of what was going on with problematic gambling. That got me to starting to use imagery to try to capture it, and it was at the same time I've been working with the population of people experiencing problem gambling and had seen thousands of people literally, and started to realize that their story could be captured in imagery. And that's how I went about designing my course. And it had a natural sort of segue into my work with clients. So the Connection program was empirically researched in 2015, and it was evaluated, and the efficacy of the program was demonstrated, and at this stage it is set to go to a randomized trial. With regards to the program itself, it's 4 sessions long. The sessions are about an hour and a half, and it's suitable for any stage of change. So with regards to readiness to change, somebody could be in an active stage, a pre-contemplation stage, contemplation stage, and even maintenance. It could be used with any population in that regard. And the way that it's delivered is delivered in a way that I express it as a common denominator. All the information is delivered in a way that we'd be speaking to the pre-contemplator. So in our line of work with problem gambling and problem gaming, most clients that are coming in presenting are not in action. They're presenting in an earlier stage, and typically they're presenting in pre-contemplation. So it was important to design a program that would meet them where they're at. And this is a key component of the program, that it is suitable for somebody who has no intention to change, and actually their level of participation in the program can be quite passive. But it tends to be an engaging program so that passivity doesn't last very long, and they start to become more actively involved in the program. The program is based in principles of motivational interviewing. I'm a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers. And so I bring that to the program. It's integrated and based in those principles. And the trans-theoretical model I mentioned. And with regards to its use, I've used it in group on an ongoing basis, and my colleagues as well use it in group. So we use it as a group program. But I find that it has actually more value when I sit with clients and we have conversations, whether it's about gambling and more recently about gaming, in terms of versions of this program that I've used for gaming and adapted to gaming, that we can weave in visual representations or experiential exercises for them to, I think it helps a lot with the engagement, and for them to kind of appreciate that there is an understanding of what they're going through, because these slides really speak to their experience. So that's the Connections program. And throughout this presentation, I will be showing you some of the slides that are used. So I've selected some of the content to include in this. The Connections program itself talks about not only how these issues develop, problematic gambling, problematic gaming, but it also talks about how in many ways it's necessary, in order for these behaviors to develop into excessive or problematic behaviors, that there needs to be coinciding disconnections. So disconnections around values, important activities that were going on. For gambling, one of the more obvious ones is a disconnection from the value of money. And the experiences, these experiences themselves are very conducive to disconnections, which we often refer to more formally as dissociation. So not being as consciously aware of what you would normally be aware of when you're doing the behavior. So the program talks a lot about that area. It also, as we move into the halfway mark, or more towards the third session, reconnection. So if there have been these disconnections, if somebody has been experiencing excessive or problematic behaviors, what might they want to consider doing about that? So that's the reconnections component, and it is truly a personal exploration of their experience. So it's take what you want and leave the rest. approach, so that the client isn't feeling forced or coerced or pressured into anything, that they can really take what they want from this program and leave the rest. So we really emphasize the personal exploration and the perspective that their relationship with these issues is a distinct, unique relationship. While there might be similarities with others, it is distinct for themselves, and we try to emphasize that sense. The behaviors that we're talking about are very similar, and so are these behaviors as well. So the nature of the Connections program really talks about there are far more similarities between these behaviors than differences. So the sense of commonalities in these behaviors was first presented by Duran Jacobs in the late 1980s with his theory referred to as the general theory of addiction, which unified the theory of addictions. And essentially what he was saying is that all these behaviors that you see on the screen would be essentially different means to the same end. So there would be different ways that a person could go about being less consciously aware of what they would be aware of. So the escape behavior, maybe potentially to feel some euphoria, some physiological arousal, whatever the case may be, that there was different ways to get to the same end. So he presented that theory, and others have followed him and shared similar perspectives on addictions. And more recently, the component model of addiction has been getting a lot of traction. It's a transdiagnostic model, and again, it would look at all these behaviors as being very similar in design in terms of their etiology, neurobiology, those kinds of aspects. And the component model would really be looking at what are the components that contribute to the addictive disorder, and those are the ones that we want to target for treatment. I'm moving into a slide in the Connections program, which is a foundational slide in terms of how I would go about dealing with cognitive distortions. So I take a very evolutionary perspective to our brains and how our brains have been designed to figure out patterns, that it was an essential evolutionary function 100,000 years ago for our survival to be able to figure out our environment. And that's the old part of our brain. And that part of our brain hasn't changed at all. It's still the very same way it was 100,000 years ago. And it continues to seek out patterns to help orientate us to, risks and, things of that nature. So we, in the Connections program, move into an experiential exercise where they see a number of different images, and the Rorschach tests are, a few of those images are in there, and they see a number of different things that would be maybe in nature, everyday occurrences, and they can start to see how their brains naturally try to see patterns in things that there really is nothing there. So it would be just a bunch of ink blots, and they would start to see patterns. So this starts to lay the foundation about how we're inclined to see these patterns by nature, and the transition to, so how does this apply to gambling, where it is very common for people to create systems, which is basically seeing patterns, and that this would be what we would expect. This would be a natural occurrence. The cognitive distortions that we identify as it pertains to gambling, we would again say these are just normal things that we would do. A lot of them are based in superstition. And we would really normalize this, and we would just turn it back to the client to reflect on that. So what does that mean with our gambling behavior? If we're by nature prone to see these patterns, that may not be there. So there's some indication from research, just kind of light stuff that would say that that research indicates that our mind will see patterns when there's not any there. So we kind of reinforce that idea, and that sets the the foundation for talking a lot about what is occurring. It's very normal in our experience with gambling behavior. There is a video, if you care to look it up. It's called Superstitious Minds. It's by the Doc Zone. And I show a clip from that in a later session, just again to reinforce that this is very normal. So rather than trying to challenge and correct cognitive distortions, we take the approach of looking at these are natural occurring experiences when it comes to gambling. And what does that mean? And what does it mean is really to start to understand it poses risk. What my mind is, we might call it mental trickery, tricking me into believing that these patterns actually exist. So our next slide is a slide from the Connections program again, minus the macaroni. So this is the first session of the program, which is more about gambling itself and not about excessive problematic gambling. And one of the ways that we try to convey probabilities and odds is to give them something more tangible and maybe experiential to be able to understand it by. This is one of the more impactful exercises that we do, and I've heard clients say, this ruined my gambling experience. So as you see, you're looking at an arrow on the left-hand side that points to $100 and an arrow on the right-hand side that points to $5,000 in 1 in 5,000 probability of winning that $100. So you guessed it, there's 5,000 pieces of macaroni in that container, and I pour them out on a big platter, and they get to see what 5,000 looks like, and one of them is colored differently. And it's couched in, it's not uncommon that we are hoping to win like $100, and this is really what it would be looking like in terms of the probability or the odds of winning that. Similarly, there's this one. Probably a lot of our participants, a lot of people participating have played the Lotto Max and maybe have kind of wondered about what these odds look like. So I went about figuring that out. So the equivalent odds of winning the Lotto Max is this. It would be walking across, whoops, we've gone backwards, my bad. There we go. It would be walking across Canada once, twice, and yes, again, 3 times. So the equivalent number of footsteps that it would take to walk across Canada 3 times would be the same, roughly the same as the odds of winning the Lotto Max, 1 in 28 million plus. So I can show this to youth, and it's interesting how struck they are by it, how big these odds are, and the explanation of our minds really don't do well with these large numbers. That we're orientated to smaller numbers, but not larger numbers, and so this gives them an opportunity to better understand what these numbers really mean. And further moving into the Connections program, while the program does look at the different theories of how these problems do occur, different theoretical perspectives, the program favors a learned behavior approach. So looking at gambling and gaming as habits, learned behavior. And this slide talks about that in terms of operant and classical conditioning, and the fact that alone, that conditioning behavior can cause problems. So we'll see people who are experiencing problems in these areas who have not had any pre-existing vulnerabilities, mental health issues, or life experiences that have put them at a higher risk. Simply through repetition and frequency, excessive play has led to the problematic behavior. So here we have, in I would suspect with the psychology students, you're well familiar with these 2 types of behavioral conditioning. Operant conditioning was discovered by B.F. Skinner, who was given the prestigious award of being named the 20th century's most influential psychologist. I had hoped that I would show you a video that he did on operant conditioning, and just in this platform we can't get that video to play. But in the video he says that operant conditioning, in particular variable racial reinforcement or random racial reinforcement, they're slightly different but very similar, is the sole reason for gambling problems. The sole reason for gambling problems. He would say that there is nothing else that is responsible for why gambling problems occur. If he was alive today, he may say the same thing about gaming. He may say variable reinforcement is the cause of gaming problems. The video was done in the late 1950s, and I think appreciating at that time there wasn't a lot known about neuroscience and some of the other aspects that we have since discovered and learned about problematic gambling. So while operant conditioning is a core piece of what causes these problems, there's other aspects that contribute to the onset of these problems as well, and those other issues I'll talk about a little bit later. And then there's classical conditioning, and Pavlov was the one who discovered classical conditioning in his famous experiments with dogs and little Albert. And I won't go into the details of those experiments, but you can see the kind of process that's going to go on in terms of the conditioning effect. More importantly, it's to understand that from an operant condition perspective, that random racial reinforcement produces both the highest rate of responding, so keeping a person going in this behavior, and creates the greatest resistance to extinction, in other words, stopping. So it's going to contribute to persistence, to keep on going, to chasing your losses, those kinds of things in both the realms of gaming and gambling. Here's a look at classical conditioning and how it may play out. So somebody who is bored starts to discover that by gambling or gaming, they can alleviate that boredom or at least dampen it to reduce it. And the other strategies or coping mechanisms that they had to relieve boredom, you may see start to drop off, and that the preferred way of doing it is gambling or gaming. So if you thought about a menu of things to do when I'm feeling bored, the first item on the menu is to gamble or game. The second item is gamble or game. The third item is gamble or game. It becomes that way at the very excessive problematic level, excluding other options. So the devices that people use, let me back up, that would be an internal trigger to game or gamble. And then there are external triggers, things like your laptop or your phone, or sounds or sights that would be an external trigger. So similarly, continued use, repetition, and frequency with these devices create this association. We might call it paired association. Another example is when there's stress, similar dynamic occurring, turning to gambling and gaming, and the corner store or the convenience store becoming the place that you buy scratch tickets or you buy these prepaid credit cards that you use for gaming. So there's association that starts to get created, and it gets stronger and stronger and stronger with more and more involvement, repetition, and frequency. Trying to advance the slide, it's slow. See down at the bottom, there's some of the things that are associated with it. And certain words can be associated with these behaviors. And one that we're familiar with is this one here. Just imagine. And if you're not familiar with it, it has something to do with gambling, more specifically lottery. The OLG would talk about Just Imagine and show all kinds of interesting things that we would fantasize about getting or winning. And I just turn it around in terms of a bit of maybe counter conditioning, we might call it, in terms of kind of just imagining what this type of conditioning can be like, how there can be these very few triggers in the beginning of the relationship with gambling and gaming, only to see these triggers grow and grow and grow over time to the point where when you want to try to stop the behavior, that there's all kinds of things that have been paired associated with it that will automatically start to trigger the thought, at least the thought, if not the urge, to want to be engaged in the behavior. So this is a troublesome aspect for people who are trying to stop the behavior, because they're often saying, how could I possibly want to stop it or be serious about stopping it if I'm thinking about it all the time? Well, it's helpful to explain to them that this is to be expected, that this conditioning effect, even though you're behaviorally trying to move away, what's occurred on a neurophysiological level is persisting, and it's going to take time for that to weaken, that connection. Another thing that we talk about in the Connections program is that these two activities have no natural endpoint. And what does that mean? It means that they're at higher risk of causing problems because you can do a lot of repetition when you're engaged in these behaviors. Different from something like substance use, where you only can take a certain amount. From food, you only can ingest a certain amount. These behaviors really don't have a natural endpoint, and that's what makes them more dangerous. Pornography would be another good example of that, in that there is no natural endpoint. You can continue to immerse yourself in this behavior, in gambling as long as the money lasts, and in these other behaviors, indefinitely. So, taking a look now at what makes online games so attractive, there's a number of different things that have been identified. The first 4 points are identified by Cam Adair, who is the developer of Game Quitters. And he talks about these are psychological needs that are being met in terms of what players are getting out of their gaming, and that these are natural drivers, like we would naturally be driven to seek out these. And if we're not seeking or not finding them in our day-to-day living, certainly going to a game can provide that, as he would say, and it can become the preferred way of meeting these psychological needs. So the opportunity for constant measurable achievement and growth, there's leaderboards, you see your scores, you see yourself leveling up, and this is in the context of more immediate gratification. The temporary spell or escape that happens, so immersion spell and flow state that occurs during the game. The clients often talk about escape, in gambling in particular, and when we talk about escape, it is at a fundamental level, it's lessening your self-awareness or escape from self-awareness of what you're experiencing. And that comes in different forms, so boredom, escaping responsibilities, grief, loss, possibly mood disorders, loneliness, stress. And as you see at the bottom, you see it's the from self-awareness is blunted a bit. So it's not always that you're totally unaware of these things, but you're less aware of those things. In the Connections program, this is a slide that's used. So it's this idea that when I go into this behavior, I'm going into essentially another state, another world. And gamers that I work with probably relate to the zone more than any other terminology. They would relate to the zone, and we explained to them that it's also called dissociation, and that's a psychological term. And it's posed to them, when you're in the state of mind and you're trying to control your behavior, how do you think that works when you're less consciously aware of what you would normally be aware of? How does that work with respect to controlling your behavior? So we just leave that. They may respond with kind of wide eyes, like that doesn't go too well, those two things. And it helps them better understand why they may have had difficulties. One of the reasons why they'd have difficulties limiting their involvement. This slide has to do, particularly if you haven't seen it, if you didn't see beyond a chance to win money or something of value. With gambling, we often think that is the main reason why people are gambling. And a study done by Youth International program out in Quebec some years ago discovered that for problematic youth, youth that were experiencing problematic gambling, their main reason for gambling was not to win money. So this was a very interesting and important discovery to understand that they were gambling for other things as well. And I would refer to those other things as non-monetary reinforcement. The escape being a big one. So the escape from what was going on in their lives, particularly uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. But excitement, which might come from the release of dopamine, to feel hope when they're feeling despair. Many youth like the idea of being able to compete and finding that gambling is a way of competing, perhaps to feel better about themselves, that they're not successful in the real world and maybe in the gambling world they could be more successful. And the anticipation effect. This is a big driver that doesn't get a lot of attention when it comes to gambling, but being able to anticipate something allows for fantasy, it allows for excitement, it allows for something to look forward to when life is mundane. So it has a real important role in the gambling behavior. If we knew what was going to happen, if it was predictable, it would not work. So anticipation is really a function of the variable ratio reinforcement. It's not predictable. So going back to these other areas that were listed, so there's infinite levels that people can stay in the game and work towards things, and the infinite levels can require enormous number of hours to get through a game. In some cases, it may be to get through a game. You're looking at 1,600 hours to go through the game if you're not buying any loot boxes or not finding other ways to take shortcuts through the game. The in-game currency that you can earn to buy those loot boxes that I mentioned, or crates, or whatever they may be, to buy skins or attractive things that you may want, or weapons. The intermittent rewards, which we had talked about, so that's a very, very, very powerful part of what keeps people involved in these games, that they aren't being rewarded all the times and only some of the times, and that pursuit of those rewards is a big part of what keeps them attracted and interested in the game. These virtual worlds keep on going on in a lot of cases, and so when a person is offline, they may want to get back online to see what is going on in this world. It's a means for instant gratification, as was mentioned earlier, autonomy, and fulfillment derived by, for some anyways, by experiencing life through an avatar, which creates a certain amount of fantasy. Fantasy being one of the things that might motivate an individual to be involved in gaming. This chart here looks at various levels of, or various areas of motivation And I find this has a lot of value for engagement. So if I sit down with a youth that's in and I ask them about their gaming behavior and then might invite them to have a look at this, they typically have a lot of interest in discovering what their profile is. What kind of gamer are they? And they would spend quite a bit of time considering it, reflecting on it. What are the most important elements of the game? Why am I attracted to it? So getting a sense of your profile, and in the resources I have a link to how that can be done. You can go online. It's about 5 minutes where somebody can go in and answer some questions, and it will provide a profile. Oftentimes these things happen in clusters, so it's going to talk about how things cluster together as well. Those who also have interest in this area of kind of separating out some of the motivators, they also separate out types of players. So they may refer to a socializer, achiever, a killer, or an explorer. So those 4 types of players. And it's said that well-designed games will incorporate those 4 types of players to allow conditions and outlets for that type of play. Another factor in terms of what makes this attractive, I am having problems advancing the slides at times, so bear with me, please. There we go. Is the role of dopamine. So gaming and gambling, they both trigger a dopamine release in much the same way. The dopamine floods the synapse, the space between 2 brain cells, in such a way that if it's excessive, if it keeps on going, if there's binge use, it starts to surpass the satiation level, the amount that it can manage in the synapse. And it starts to create a dynamic where other molecules start to get involved. And I'm not going to go into that neuroscience part of it, but long story short is that's what starts to create the brain changes. So this excessive use leading to the oversaturation of that area, and then leading to brain changes. So the dopamine experience is really an integrated experience. So it's how it gets stimulated and released is really an integrated experience in terms of it's not just one thing. There's a number of things that are going on in the game. So there's a certain amount of suspense, and there's never-ending novelty at your fingertips. There's the music. There's these high-tech graphics. There's the ability to achieve goals, both big and small, and even the small goals are associated with dopamine rewards. And then there's the competition, unlocking the game, so they're getting to different levels. And again, with the youth that I'm working with, they would often say this is one of the bigger motivating factors, or the things that they get a lot of enjoyment out of. And obviously that would be associated with a dopamine release. Competing with other players, and then there's that disconnection from the world. So I would encourage you to look at it as an integrated experience and what is behind the dopamine release. And I'll talk about the types of changes that can occur a little bit later. Another attraction to playing the games and gambling is, for some youth, it appears to be a way to create a career. So in some ways they may be chasing a new vocation. So esports has become very, very big, and you'll see that off to the right, and that there's some pretty famous youth that have made millions and millions of dollars in that venue, in that area. And in maybe not as much today as the past, but youth certainly getting inspired by seeing other youth or young adults winning big poker tournaments. Another factor in terms of the attraction is the amount of advertising that is going on these two topics, encouraging participation in gambling and gaming. Certainly through social media, there's a lot of advertising, and it's thought with social media that the number one advertisement is gambling advertisement. But certainly that exposure would be something that brings people back to those behaviors. They do the advertising because it works. So now we're going to move into talking about some of the risks associated with these two behaviors. And off to the right, you'll see that there is a representation of risk as it pertains to gaming, and virtual reality being the highest risk form of gaming involvement. And this is referred to as dependence liability. But the conversation for youth would really just be that games are all the same, and there's properties to some games that create more risk, that they'll become things that people do excessively and problematically. These are some guidelines that have been provided by Leonard Sachs, who wrote the book Boys Adrift. And he suggests that during school weeks that there shouldn't be any more than 40 minutes of video gaming per night, and 1 hour on the weekends or vacations. No mature games unless they're of the age to play them. He talks about avoiding games where there is moral inversion. So what is normally bad is good, and what's normally bad, good is bad. And avoid games where there's violence that is depicted as fun or funny. Avoid games where real life consequences of violence are lacking in the game. And he strongly stresses that that there wouldn't be any games or screens rather in the bedroom. So he's against having any screens in the bedroom. And obviously that's something that if it was started when a child was young, would be a lot easier to implement when they're in adolescence. And at the same time that there is this recommendation, I think this recommendation is consistent with the American Pediatrics Society's recommendation as well. There are some findings that 1 hour of video game playing a day can actually enhance psychological well-being, while anything above and beyond that, and particularly once you hit the 3-hour point, is associated with less well-being. So there's a lot of people who have studied this area and would say that in terms of screen time, that no more than 2 hours of screen time in a day would be at a lower risk level. Beyond the 2 hours increases risk. Associated with risk is also technology. So comparing our gaming and gambling today to the past is like comparing apples and oranges. Technology has really greatly changed the way that we can gamble, the way that we can game. And in these ways, it's made it faster, more interactive, and more accessible. Another factor is that it's made the access to money easier. So whether it be by cards or making transactions electronically, being able to buy those prepaid credit cards so that youth can go online and play these games, it's played a significant role as well. And then there's the area of persuasive technology, where neuroscientists and psychologists have implemented ways to make these games more attractive, to keep the player playing longer and longer and longer. And that's really what it all comes down to, is keeping them on the device as long as possible. So all this was going to equate into a much higher risk of problems. looking at some of the risk factors. So interacting with the conditioning effect will be risk factors. So thinking about the conditioning effect plus your personal characteristics, your personal situation at the time that you're involved in this, and your life experiences. So all these will interact, and these are things that we talk about in the Connections program, so that people get a better understanding of their personal relationship with these devices, whether it's gaming or whether it's gambling. No surprise that with this population that are, at least the ones that are presenting for treatment, there's typically a co-occurring mental health issue. And one of the things that can happen through excessive or problematic gambling is the crowding out effect. So if I'm going to spend 5 hours gaming, what am I crowding out? What is it taking the place of? So what is it displacing? And Leonard Sachs talks about that in terms of his study of males, and particularly males that are of the college age, that he says that academic motivation is replaced by getting to the next level of the game. So the motivation shifts away from the real world to the virtual world, and that this becomes their focus. Cam Adar talks about that the experience of gaming can really warp an individual's perception of effort, value, and reward. So he would talk about how it is that the immediate gratification, the constant feedback that you get, the kind of ease that you can make it, achievements, you can reach your goals, that this warps the perception of what it's really like to achieve goals, and that this doesn't fit with the real world where it typically takes time, it takes a lot of effort and work and persistence to get to the goals. So he's saying that essentially that psychologically that there is impact on the perception of how much effort, time should be taken to achieve things, and that things should be relatively easy. So this leads to procrastination of things like homework or looking for a job. Many of the studies are saying that the youth today are less prepared for adulthood than ever before any generation prior. In terms of the brain changes, this comes from Gary Wilson, and he talks about, there's a reference to him as well in the resources. He talks about that all addictions are going to lead to certain brain changes if the behavior is prolonged and excessive. So one of the issues is a numb pleasure response, that the reward center of the brain is affected in such a way that the person would not experience pleasure in other activities other than the gaming and the gambling. And in contrast, that they would be hyper reactive to gaming and gambling, so they'd be most excited with that. That would be the one that they get. They would maybe express it as the only enjoyment out of. I've had clients say to me that gambling itself has been the best feeling they ever experienced, bar anything else in their life. Nothing else is compared to the experience. And then willpower erosion refers to how, with the release of dopamine, which happens just above the brainstem, there's actually a pathway that goes up into the prefrontal cortex, which then starts to affect the functioning of the prefrontal cortex, where you have your executive function, so you're able to exercise rational decision-making and judgment and have self-control. And this area of the brain is shown to be affected negatively. In the gambling description of it with clients, I refer to it as disrupting or disordering the prefrontal cortex so that you are not able to make the same type of decision-making when you're not in gambling as when you are in gambling. Another possible risk is this, that it can start, the gaming and the gambling can start to reprioritize basic needs and drives. So youth would most commonly relate to sleep. So we imagine that gambling and gaming aren't one of the primary drives for the person or needs, but it does become that way through their involvement, frequency, and repetition again. And then it can start to reprioritize. Whoops, that was very quick. It can start to reprioritize the need for sleep, the need for eating, to taking their responsibilities seriously, to fulfilling their responsibilities. So that might be doing things that helps protect their shelter, a basic need, so that they are, following the rules of the home, those kinds of things that allows them to stay in the home, affecting relationships. And in some cases, it may even affect their very survival. Certainly in gambling, that happens a lot with not so much youth, but with adults who might become suicidal. But treating themselves in ways where they're taking risks, where they're not really paying attention to their own safety. So in gambling, oftentimes it's someone who's been up for 24 hours and is driving home, those kinds of things, or taking more risks, reckless behavior. So at this point, I think I've covered as much as I want to cover with the presentation, and wanted to leave some time for questions. So let's do that now.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve, and to all of you who are still tuned in. I know we're going over a tiny bit, but for those of you who weren't here when I first introduced the presentation or who have to head out soon, I want you to know that this event is being recorded in full, and we will post the full webinar on our website, and we will also send it to those of you who signed up via Constant Contact for this event. So if you don't mind, Steve, I'll get questions started. I got a question typed from Douglas, and they'd like to know, is there any push to include problem gambling indicators in evaluating gaming addiction in the criteria for evaluation, or is problem gambling, it's a very tiny window, or is problem gambling behavior that occurs in video games going to be diagnosed under a problem gambling criteria?
That is a great question in terms of how to really approach that issue. I'm not familiar where things are at today, but it is a very good question. How will it be looked at? I think with the crossover, it may be that they will look at it as this is the criterion. Like today, they're trying to say that it is gambling behavior. Those in the industry say it's gambling-like behavior. But the criterion for problematic gambling, I think, would be very suitable for the criterion.
Great. Michael has raised his hand, so I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, Michael. Oh, I wonder if he's... Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I didn't raise my hand. I was just asking if you could please show the reference slide again. I wouldn't mind seeing it again, please.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Does anyone else have any questions for Steve? I'm not seeing any raised hands right now. And so if that is all for questions for now, I did get a couple comments sort of directly to me, Steve, as the facilitator, saying thank you for people who had to run out and that it was really wonderful. So I will echo that and say thank you so much, Steve, for your presentation. To those of you who are connected, I will send out resources for you. I will send out a recording. And I want to thank you all very much for participating. Any final words from you, Steve?
I'd like to thank everyone as well, and thank yourself, Lindsay, for facilitating it, putting it together.
Wonderful. Well, have a great Wednesday, everyone.